Brother, I'm Dying by Edwige Danticat. Chapter 16, titled Hell. Grandma Melina liked to tell a story about a man who one day fell asleep and woke up in a foreign land where he knew no one and no one knew him. Finding himself on his back in the middle of a dirt road filled with strangers, he looked up at the blurry faces around him, which were framed by a gloomy gray sky, and asked, "Where am I?" "You're where you are," answered a booming voice. "Where's that?" he asked. "Where you need to be," replied the voice. "I didn't ask to be here," the man said, "wherever it is." "No matter how you ended up here," said the voice, "here you are." Tired of the roundabout conversation, the man said, "I want you to tell me right now where I am. If you don't, I'm going to be angry." "Who cares about your anger?" answered the voice. "No one is scared of you here." Truly upset now, the man said, "Tell me where I am right now." "You are in hell," replied the voice. And since these were long ago times, the man didn't know what hell was, even though he could already see that it was not a happy place. "What is hell?" he asked. "Hell," replied the voice, "is whatever you fear most." The next morning, Monday, at 4 a.m., Maxo, his children, his aunt and uncles reluctantly left for Legoan. My uncle sat alone in his room and gathered some papers, including his passport and his Miami plane ticket, which he'd purchased weeks before to visit some Haitian churches there. He was scheduled to leave on Friday, October 29, just as he'd told my father. The plane ticket bookmarked the Lord's Prayer in his Bible. He would now leave the house. For how long, he wasn't sure, but he hadn't wanted to put the children's lives in danger by walking out with them. Besides, he was still hoping that the situation might somehow be resolved. He could talk to the Dreads, as the Dreadlock gang leaders were also called, and explain. After all, before they were called Dreads or even Chimeras, they were young men, boys, many of whom had spent their entire lives in the neighborhood. He knew their mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, uncles, and aunts. Some of them had attended his church, his school, had eaten in his lunch program. Many had been to his church for christenings, weddings, and funerals. He would often lend them his generator for soccer tournaments and block parties. He'd even given many of the U.S. deportees among them jobs as English tutors for his students. The shooting from his roof had destroyed an uneasy equilibrium between him and them, but surely one of them would have had a fond memory that could override what they wrongly believed he'd done. Before heading downstairs, my uncle removed the suit he'd had on since the day before and changed into a maroon pants and gray jacket ensemble he sometimes wore on long trips to the countryside. He put on a pair of old brown leather shoes, which, like all his other shoes, had been repaired and resoled many times. "I'm not going anywhere," he wanted his clothes to say, and up to that point he wasn't sure he was. As soon as he walked down to the courtyard, he heard one of his neighbors hissing at the side gate, trying to get his attention. It was barely light, but the streets were already full with vendors hawking their wares and people walking back from mass, children heading to school, and camions and taxis dropping off and picking up fares. His neighbor Darlie, a tall and skinny girl with long braids dangling past her waist, quickly slipped through when he opened the gate and pulled it shut behind her. "Pastor," she whispered, "last night they took the church's generator. When Gigi tried to stop them, they picked her up and threw her off one of the terraces." "Oh, bon Dieu, my God," he mouthed, raising both his hands to his head. How could Gigi, another kind neighbor, have put herself between an armed gang and a generator? And how could he have not heard her screams from his room? "Is she alive?" he mouthed. He knew better than to use his voice box, which would draw attention. "One of her legs is broken," the neighbor continued. "She's in the hospital." My uncle reached into his pocket where he had his passport and plane ticket, and into his jacket pocket where he often kept his Bible on the off chance there might be a few dollars left. All his money was gone. "But this is not what I came to say. Pastor, you should leave now. They're coming. Go away quick. They're coming." She unlatched the gate and slipped out. My uncle was trying to close it behind her when a man's large hand reached in and yanked the metal latch away from his fingers. A short, beefy youth with a small Haitian flag wrapped around his head quickly stepped into the courtyard. He had a face pockmarked with what looked like lines of razor scars. He was followed by another man, this one taller, thinner, with a thin, uneven beard and a white fishnet cap covering an abundant head of long, dreadlocked hair. A bald-headed man followed. The last one opened the gate wider to allow in a few others. Then followed another group, then another, all their faces quickly merging into one angry haze. Suddenly he understood the true workings of a mob, one infuriated body morphing into another until they all became limbs to one raging monster. The courtyard was soon filled with young men, and when he looked up at the balconies and terraces, they were crammed too. "Pastor," the Chief Dread shouted, his voice strained and hoarse, "thanks to you, we lost 15 guys yesterday, and we have 6 with bullet wounds. Because you let the fuckers in, you need to pay or we'll cut your head off." The Chief Dread particularly cited the cases of 2 young men my uncle knew, both not yet 20 years old. During the raid, a bullet had fractured one's ribs, the other had been shot in the stomach. Their families were afraid to take them to the public hospital, the Chief Dread said, because assuming that they were all criminals, the police routinely shot young men with bullet wounds there. They needed money to find a doctor for these men and others, a doctor who would come to them. The amount he was asked to pay was so impossibly high to even remember. It might as well have been $1 billion. Hoping to reason, my uncle reached over and tried to touch the Dread's burly arm. The Dread shoved his hand aside with enough force to make him nearly lose his balance. As he steadied himself on his feet, my uncle raised his voice box to his neck and said, "Tande." The Chief Dread motioned for quiet among the growing crowd. "I need time," my uncle continued. "I need to make some phone calls. I need to get in touch with my family in New York. I need to ask them to send me some money. My phone is not working. I have to find a phone. Come back this afternoon at 1 and I'll have something for you." The Chief Dread looked over at the crowd, then up at the classroom balconies, eyeing those gathered for their approval. He then raised his sizable hands in the air, like Moses parting the Red Sea, signaled for them to scatter. But they didn't go far. Splitting into smaller groups, they stormed the terrace classrooms and began grabbing whatever was within reach, the blackboards, benches. Some detached the doors from hinges and took off with them. The top Dreads moved aside, allowing more people into the courtyard even as they stepped out. My uncle was completely surrounded, but no one was touching him. Everyone was heading farther into the compound, toward his apartment, the church. From where he was standing, totally frozen in a spot near a small outdoor grill that was Maxo's wife sometimes used to cook their meals, he could see many of his neighbors scurrying off with his things. Nana, an old woman, limping with a cane, carrying some of his dinner plates. Danielle, a small girl whose mother sold water to him now and then, joining strangers as they walked by with a handful of Maxo's children's clothes. He could now see the navy blue cotton and lycra suit he'd worn to his wife's funeral, the one in which he wanted to be buried, walking away in some boy's arms. As the crowd rushed back and forth around him, there went the charcoal grill and his wind-up alarm clock. He did not dare move to the other side of the courtyard where a plume of smoke was rising outside the church. "They're burning the altar of the church," someone yelled, and some of the direction, that is, the school principal's office. The crowd began heading that way, but he remained in place, not moving. He wanted to go to the church, to see it, to defend it, to reclaim the altar. But what if the crowd decided at that moment to burn him too? What he couldn't see was the pews and altar being dragged into the middle of the street and set on fire. Part of his office, which was directly beneath the church, was also burned, his papers, including the dozens of notepads in which he jotted down words and sentences, his observations about the neighborhood, in good times and bad. They were all scattered now, all over the streets, being trampled, carried away, or burned. The courtyard was nearly empty now, with everyone's focus shifted to the church. The few people who were still milling about shamefully avoided his eyes as they walked by, one with a handful of new toothbrushes he'd kept on the night table in his bedroom upstairs. He had to get out now, finally leave the neighborhood for good, but how would he get through the barricades where surely the Dreads had people waiting, watching for him? As he moved toward the gate, he spotted Anne, the niece of his old friend Ferna, standing there across the alley watching him. Had she turned against him too? Had her aunt? Anne held out her empty hands, showing that she was carrying nothing. She had not stolen from him. "Vinny," she said, "come." He went without thinking, letting her drag him by the hand. Walking the slippery incline that separated his house from another small courtyard, he kept his face down, his chin as close as he could to his chest without blocking his tracheotomy hole. He did not dare look back toward the church as the new wave of looters brushed past him, heading there. He might have been tempted to follow them, to try not to stop them, reason with them. He thought about all the wounded who might be lying somewhere dying. He thought of their mothers, fathers, standing over them, unable to do anything but watch. The country was once again losing a generation of young people, some violent, some bystanders, but all in the line of fire, dying. The courtyard he and Anne stepped into led to a series of narrow alleyways, some haphazardly paved in slippery concrete, some packed with dirt and mud, and others dotted with pools of stagnant, dirty water. The neighborhood's labyrinth of corridor-sized alleys was like tunnels leading everywhere, but alas, only within the neighborhood. He was not too familiar with the path Anne was leading him on now. New houses, shacks, were being built all the time, creating newer and narrower trails. Finally, she opened a corrugated iron gate, pasted together with several rusting pieces, and stepped inside. The yard was only large enough for a latrine and a concrete water basin capped by a rusting faucet. Without saying a word, Anne's Aunt Ferna, a beautifully portly young woman, motioned for him to enter the crowded darkness of her house. Hot and sweaty now, he felt his way past a beaded curtain to a corner between a small dining room table and her bed. "Pastor, you can stay here until dark," she said. "Then we'll find somewhere for you to go." The wicker chair she gave him to sit on was much too low, and his back ached as he shifted now and then, hoping to find a comfortable position. But he had to remain there, she insisted, in case someone walked into the house. He could easily slide under the table and remain out of sight. Crouched there, he could hear the normal sounds of the day, a woman's chiding her maid for a lunch that had been burned, a father cursing the schoolmaster who would send his son home because the father had not been able to pay the month's tuition. At the same time, some people were walking by saying, "Did you hear? They nearly killed Pastor." He heard many variations of this, people dashing to the courtyard to see, to his apartment to find out what they could get. His entire life was now reduced to an odd curiosity, a looting opportunity. He was grateful, however, that no one seemed to know where that he was there, hiding. Some thought he had actually been killed. Others seemed certain he had fled. The neighborhood talk soon moved on to other things. Again, the more mundane details of daily life. The egg seller came to collect a debt from Ferna. A friend stopped by to braid Anne's hair. The visitors were greeted at the door and not allowed inside. He tried to think of where he might go next. Surely the Dreads had gone to look for him. Perhaps they'd only wanted him to flee, to leave the compound so that they could confiscate it. Ferna and Anne had no news. They, like him, had no landline or cell phone. They were even afraid to turn on their radio, afraid they might draw someone's attention. Had they turned on the radio, they would have heard that the Haitian riot police and the Minister were out on another sweeping operation. This time it was in nearby Fort National, not far from the country's national archives, where 12 young men were shot and killed. Later that afternoon, my uncle somehow managed to drift off to sleep. Thankfully, he had always been able to sleep no matter what. Perhaps it was because he was constantly busy, waking up early and going to bed late. He also liked to walk, often overexerting himself. No matter what, his body could always shut itself down, forcing him to rest. When he woke up, Ferna was shaking him. He could feel her breath on his face, but could not see her in the dark. "Pastor," Ferna said, her voice dragging with worry and sleep. "You should go now. You should leave." "What time is it?" he asked, making sure his voice box was at the lowest possible volume. 3:30 a.m., she said. Nearly at the same time, he remembered that Maxo, his aunt and uncle, and the children had left. Where would he go now? He could go to Le Goan and join them, but would he make it through the barricades into the bus depot? He could also go to Tante Z's in Delmas, but would he have the same problem? He could think of only one solution. Tante Denise had a cousin who lived right on the fringes of the neighborhood, near the perimeters of the gang's barricades. Her house was somewhere between the Lycée Pétion and Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church, where the UN tanks often gathered. If he could make it to her place, then he could wait for an opportune moment when the tanks were there to slip out of the neighborhood. You know Manjou? He asked Ferna. She did. I'll go to her house, he said. She has a telephone. I can call Maxo from there. I don't want him to try to come back from me. They might kill him. Now he could also hear the shuffle of other feet in the dark. Anne's. Anne lit a small kerosene lamp and moved it toward his face. You can't go out in your own clothes, Ferna said. We need to disguise you. Reaching into an open suitcase laid out by his feet, Ferna pulled out a dark, curly, shoulder-length wig, a wide-rimmed wicker sun hat, and a long, flowered muumuu large enough to fit over his clothes. He couldn't figure out why she had all these things packed in the suitcase like that. Maybe she was thinking that one day she too might need to escape. You must disguise yourself, Ferna insisted again. It will be light soon and someone might see you. What choice did he have? He could not let himself be captured. He could not surrender either, to be butchered or to die. So he let Ferna and Anne slip the muumuu over his clothes. As they placed the wig on his head, the hair fell against the side of his face, itching, just as his wife's wigs had when he would kiss her long ago. Though she wore wigs for a long time, he remembered how often she found them intolerable, yanking them off her head as soon as she got home. Wearing the wig and with the muumuu over his own clothes, he stepped out into the alley with Anne and Ferna at his side. There was an odd stillness in the neighborhood, the houses merging with the murky shadows in the dark. As they guided him up and down the hills and inclines of the winding neighborhood alleyways, he felt like a blind man being led through a labyrinth. Walking briskly, they would occasionally come across a boy stumbling home drunk, a girl heading to sleep after a night of selling her body, a man, or was it a woman, who, following a furtive look at his very male shoes, quickly hurried past them, head further bent, face further hidden, this person perhaps also a fugitive, perhaps also fleeing. Manjou bore the balloon-shaped jowls of Tante Denise's clan as they aged. She was often ready with the smile, but even readier with the scowl. She was known for her quick temper, but also for her generosity and sense of humor. So when Uncle Joseph showed up at her door dressed in drag, she opened the door, laughed, and let him in. Her house, like Ferna's, was small, a living room with one even smaller bedroom. However, she had a large bed, with enough room for someone to disappear under it without suffocating. My uncle spent the next 2 days at Manjou's house, sleeping on a twin mattress at the foot of her bed. As he lay there, often after attempting a series of phone calls through which he'd been unable to reach either Maxo and the children or Tante Z, he would listen to Manjou's accounts of an increasingly dismal state of affairs. In nearby Rue Saint-Martin, the police had ordered 4 young men to lie face down on the ground and had shot them at close range in the back of the head. Their bodies were left to rot on the street for more than 48 hours as a gruesome deterrent. In the meantime, the gangs had constructed new barricades near his church with trash and burnt-out cars. Only residents who were on good terms with the gang members were being allowed to enter his street. The gangs had set up residence in his apartment, the school, the church, establishing a base from which to operate on his premises. If he ever comes back, the Chief Dread was said to have declared, we'll burn him alive.